In 2017, quarterback Carson Wentz was having an MVP caliber season where he threw for over 3,000 yards, 33 touchdowns, and only 7 interceptions in just 13 games. However, a torn ACL would cut his season short, but the Eagles would still go to the number 1 seed and they would still win the Super Bowl. And if Carson Wentz wouldn't have got hurt, he would have won MVP. However, 7 years and 4 teams later, Carson Wentz is a backup quarterback on the Chiefs, and his MVP caliber play, his even Pro Bowl caliber play, is long over. To tell the full story, we have to go back to 2016. Carson Wentz was entering that year's draft from North Dakota State, an FCS school, and in his 4 seasons there, he was very good, and he led North Dakota State to probably the greatest FCS dynasty of all time. I mean, he was phenomenal. His time at North Dakota State mixed in with this great size and athleticism, he was a pretty nice quarterback draft prospect entering the 2016 NFL Draft. Wentz was such a good draft prospect that he was the second quarterback taken. In fact, he was the second player overall taken as he was drafted by the Philadelphia Eagles, and the only guy who went in front of him was Cal's Jared Goff, who was drafted by the Rams. Before Wentz, we had Nick Foles, who in 2013 had a really bizarre season. He had a great season where he threw for a little under 3,000 yards, 27 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. By the way, he had a 7 touchdown game, and he made the Pro Bowl that year and led the Eagles to the playoffs. But in 2014, he struggled. He wasn't himself like he was in 2013, and the Eagles missed the playoffs. After the 2014 season, the Eagles decided that Nick Foles was not the quarterback for the future, so they traded him to the Rams for Sam Bradford, and in this one and only season as an Eagle, he was better than Nick Foles in 2014, but he was nothing special, and it was time that the Eagles started looking for a permanent quarterback for the future. However, in the upcoming draft, they were not bad enough to get a top overall pick, but they also weren't bad enough to get a late first round pick to draft someone like Paxton Lynch. So they decided to trade up to number 2 overall, and that's how they got Carson Wentz. And if you don't know who that random guy is in the background, that's the GM of the Eagles, Howie Roseman, in case you're confused. But now we get to Carson Wentz's rookie season, and the first 3 games of the year were phenomenal as the Eagles got off to a hot 3-0 start. And if you look at his stats, they're not too bad either. 5 touchdowns and no interceptions, and his passing yards, they were looking pretty good as well. And for a rookie quarterback to lead his team out to a 3-0 start, that's very rare. Even the quarterbacks who have had the best rookie seasons of all time have not been able to accomplish that feat. However, in their last 13 games, they would go 4-9, and the Eagles would finish 7-9 and would have finished last in a very stacked NFC East in 2016. That 5 touchdown, 0 interception Carson Wentz had at the start of the season turned out to be a fluke for his rookie year, as he ended up only finishing with under 4,000 yards, 16 touchdowns, and 14 interceptions. That's not a good touchdown-interception ratio. It makes it worse when 4th-round quarterback Dak Prescott, whose on-division rival the Dallas Cowboys, had a significantly better season and led the Dallas Cowboys to the number 1 seed in the NFC, and he took home Offensive Rookie of the Year honors, even though it should have been his teammate running back Ezekiel Elliott. At least he wasn't number 1 overall pick Jared Goff, who only started 7 games and he lost all of them, and he only threw for a little over 1,000 yards, 5 touchdowns, and 7 interceptions. Yeah, it was not a good rookie year for Goff. However, in 2017, everything was about to change. Through 13 games of the 2017 NFL season, Carson Wentz was looking like the best quarterback in the NFL as he threw for a little over 3,000 yards, 33 touchdowns, and only 7 interceptions. He had led the Eagles to an 11-2 record, and they were sitting as not just the number 1 seed in the NFC, but they were looking like the best team in the NFL. Wentz was easily looking like the best quarterback from his draft class, and he looked like he was a future face of the NFL, and for certain, the quarterback of the future for the Philadelphia Eagles. But in a Week 14 game against Jared Goff's Rams, who were having a pretty good season for themselves up to that point, Carson Wentz would tear his ACL and it would completely end his season. They were already locked in for the playoffs, but without their starting quarterback leading the way, this seemed like a lost season. It seemed like the year was over. And speaking of which, who was going to be the quarterback now? Well, it's our old friend Nick Foles, who in his first and only season in 2015 with the Rams, he was awful, and he decided to move on, and during the 2016 offseason, he was contemplating retirement. I don't know if I said that word right, but he was thinking about retirement, but decided to play, and he signed as a backup with the Kansas City Chiefs in 2016 before finding his way back on the Eagles as a backup in 2017, and in the few games he started in Carson Wentz absence during the late games of the season, he wasn't too bad. 5 touchdowns, 2 picks, and 537 yards, and he went 2-0 in the 2 full games he started. But in the Eagles' first game in the playoffs, it would come in the divisional round, and they would have to go up against the 6th seed, the Atlanta Falcons, who were just coming off a Super Bowl appearance, and for the first time ever, a number 1 seed in the divisional round would open up as underdogs. They were not favored to win. It just goes to show how much the Eagles were doubted against without Carson Wentz. But in a very sloppy game, the Eagles would come out on top 15-10 as the Eagles would stop Julio Jones on the final play of the game at the 2-yard line. And now we move on to the NFC Championship, and they were going up against the Vikings, and really no one was giving them a chance. For one, they were just coming off the Minneapolis Miracle, one of the greatest plays in NFL history, and the Vikings were riding high off that. Number 2, this Vikings team was led by quarterback Case Keenum, who up to this point was easily the best story in the NFL. He had turned from a career backup quarterback to the starting quarterback of the number 2 team in the NFC, and he was putting up pretty good numbers too. And number 3, during the Eagles divisional round game, Nick Foles, he didn't look impressive at all, and when you mix all these factors in, it just didn't look like the Eagles were going to win at all. No one was giving them a chance. But the final result shocked everybody. Nick Foles, the backup quarterback of potentially the MVP of the NFL, blew out the Vikings 38-7, and they were moving on to the Super Bowl. Nick Foles had a great day, 352 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, compared to no interceptions. But this incredible limb-standing run was going to have to come to an end, because in the Super Bowl, the Eagles and Nick Foles were going up against the greatest player in NFL history in Tom Brady and that incredible defense. There's no way they were going to beat them, or so we thought. Nick Foles would lead the Philadelphia Eagles to a 41-33 victory over Tom Brady and the New England Patriots, capping off one of the greatest Cinderella and underdog stories in sports history. Nick Foles had a legendary game, 373 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, 1 interception, but also a receiving touchdown, and no surprise, he won Super Bowl MVP. I don't think it's crazy to assume that this played a part in Carson Wentz's downfall, as Nick Foles completely took over the team and led them to the Super Bowl, and this probably would have hurt Carson Wentz's mentality in some way or another. When he came back in 2018, he'd only play 11 games and his numbers took a dip, but in 2019 he'd play every single game and put up similar numbers. Not his same MVP caliber season, but they were still good seasons, and he led the Eagles to the playoffs in both of them. In the 2018 wildcard game, the Eagles beat the Bears off of a Cody Parkey double doink that you've probably seen, and then in the divisional round, they almost beat the 1-seed Saints. However, Carson Wentz was not leading the way in both of those games, as it was Nick Foles. But in 2019, however, Carson Wentz was finally healthy enough to start a playoff game. However, he was concussed during the game and he'd have to be taken out, and the Eagles would lose 17-9. Now, up to this point, Carson Wentz, he's been a pretty good quarterback, arguably top 10 in the NFL. He's put up some pretty good stats. He's led his team to the playoffs, and he even had an MVP caliber season in 2017. He just needs to stay on the field. He's been getting injured way too much. However, in 2020, the rails were about to completely come off. In 2020, Carson Wentz went from arguably a top 10 quarterback in the NFL to arguably the worst in the NFL, and he easily had his worst season. He went 3-8-1 in 12 starts, only threw for 2,620 yards, 16 touchdowns, and 15 interceptions. That's just straight up horrible. Second round rookie quarterback from Oklahoma, Jalen Hurts, would take over for the last 4 games, and even though his stats do look spotty, if you saw him play, you knew that he looked better than Carson Wentz, and he was going to be the future for this team. Yeah, the Eagles drafted a quarterback in the second round of the 2020 NFL Draft. This was prior to Carson Wentz playing terrible, and the fact they drafted a quarterback could have hurt Wentz's mentality on the field, and I don't think that's too crazy to assume. Like I said, after that atrocious season, the Eagles decided to focus around Jalen Hurts, and they would trade Carson Wentz to the Indianapolis Colts, where Wentz would get a fresh start. But in his first season with the Colts, he had bounced back as he'd started every game, and up to that point, he had led the Colts to a 9-7 record, and he had thrown for 3,563 yards, 27 touchdowns, and 7 interceptions. And I don't know why we keep on seeing that same stat line with like 27 touchdowns and 7 interceptions. That's very bizarre. In the final game of the season, like I said, the Colts were sitting at 9-7, and they're playing against the worst team in the NFL, and the Jacksonville Jaguars. All they need to do is beat the worst team in the NFL to clinch a spot in the playoffs, and if they lose, they're out. But we don't really have to worry about that. They're going to win. Instead, the Colts would get demolished 26-11 by the worst team in the NFL, and Carson Wentz did not have a good game either. I mean, this was kind of his fault as well. And just like that, a rather good season was now going to be remembered by them losing against the worst team in the NFL to miss the playoffs. And the Colts, instead of keeping Carson Wentz, decided to trade him after the season ended to the Washington Commanders. So Wentz having to start with a new team, this time returning to the NFC East, it was getting wild for Wentz's career. It turns out that while he was with Indianapolis, Wentz was just not a bad leader, and he was also arguing with coaches, and this could have possibly dated back with Philadelphia. So you add all this in, this contributes to the downfall for sure. However, in 2022 with the Commanders, Carson Wentz might have had an even worse season than 2020. Yeah, this might have been his worst season as an NFL quarterback. He went 2-5 in 7 starts, only threw for 1,755 yards, 11 touchdowns, and 9 interceptions. His backup quarterback Taylor Heinicke would go on to start 8 games, and he was clearly better than Carson Wentz. He threw for almost 2,000 yards, 12 touchdowns, and 6 interceptions, and in the 8 games he started, he went 5-3, and if the Commanders started him for the whole season, they would have made the playoffs. This season would end the days of Carson Wentz as a starter in the NFL, as after the season, the Commanders would release Carson Wentz. After that, in 2023, he'd sign with the Rams and start 1 game, which was the final game of the season, and he won. And this offseason, he took a backup deal with the Kansas City Chiefs. The downfall of Carson Wentz is really sad. In just his second year, he was an MVP candidate, and you could technically say he led his team to a Super Bowl victory, even though he wasn't playing in those games, and the potential for him was skyrocketing high. And now you cut to 7 years later, and he's a backup, and he hasn't started an NFL game in 2 seasons. It's really sad to see. If you're an Eagles fan, this video probably made you sad, but anyway, that's about it.